Welcome to video 2. As promised, we're going to look at a website that's already been built, or to be more precise, it is still being built and altered. It's March at the moment. I put it online sometime, I think, around the end of January. So in less than 2 months, if I show you this, in less than 2 months it is on the first page of Google. So my point is, this is not just a theoretical way of writing HTML. It does really get results, and it gets results for all of my clients. Right, let's begin. Somewhere in here, I'm doing all this on a Linux desktop PC that my company makes. One of the reasons I like Linux is that the default font size is a little bit bigger than on Windows. I find that a lot easier to read. Having said that, I don't know where I've put the script. Hold on a moment. Right, there it is. This then is the list of all the pages and all the folders that are on the company website, computerbuild.uk. These are HTML files. Those are the folders that contain other things. Let me just draw your attention to the HTML files. You'll see they've all got a number of words, and those words have been carefully worked out to describe what the page is about. Keep the titles fairly short, but think about what it is that's going to go on the page, and then give the page the appropriate name, such as privacy-spying-security.html. The other point I would make is that one of the rules of the internet is that the first page, your landing page, your starter page on your website, has to be called index.html. I think there is one other title you can give it which escapes me for the moment, but I always call them index.html. That allows the search engines to understand where the website begins. So we'll look at that, and this is how page 1 of the website looks. We're going to analyze in this episode, video 2, how the header has been put together. As you can see, there's an image of blue sea, which I cut from a larger picture. This is actually a background image. There are foreground images and background images. This here is a foreground image. This is a background image, and they behave differently even if they look the same. On the left hand side we have the title of the company, the menu, which we're going to deal with in a separate video, and on the right hand side there's some artwork. Now if we call up Genie, this was the page that we looked at on video 1. We're going to call up a new file now. And there it is. Let me expand it a little bit. I think that's about the right size. So we talked about this in the last video, where the heading of the HTML is doctype HTML, and we open the HTML information there, and way down at the bottom of the page we close the HTML, and there's the header that we mentioned, and we still haven't discussed the content of that header. We'll come back to that, but there's the header closed. Something I don't think I mentioned in the last video: once we've closed the header, we open the body, and this is the part that your viewers will see. We've opened the body there, and we've closed the body there with the triangular brackets and the forward slash, and as you can see, there's a fair bit of content on it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the header, and I will come back to headers in more detail. Some of this we're just going to ignore. I've put on my website, I'll put the address at the end of this video, I've put on the website a link that contains all of this text so that you can just cut and paste it into your video editor. This thing here, meta content, that is again just telling the browser what the language is. We don't have to worry about that. We just cut it and paste it. The title, open brackets, close brackets. Title is important, and it's going to introduce the entire website. Computer built Linux computers made in Cheshire. Keywords, I haven't put keywords in yet. I will do shortly, but I'm still actually building the website. Keywords are less important than they once were. Going back to the beginning of the internet, keywords were everything, because the very simple search engines that were in existence used to rely exclusively on keywords. We now have robots and crawlers and all kind of electronic devices that read internet traffic, and therefore the keywords aren't too important. In the old days, you used to be able to mislead the system by putting in certain keywords, and those days have long gone. After the keywords, I will fill that in when I get time, we have the meta name description. This is read by the search engines, and this wording will be reproduced in the search result when you do a search on Google or on whatever search engine you're using, and the website comes up in answer to your search results. That will be the text that comes up together with the website link and the website address. If you don't put much information there, the system will try and grab some other text from the website lower down. So while I'm here, this is something that doesn't appear on all websites. This instruction, again, you can simply copy and paste it from the link at the end of the video. This is a cache control instruction, and it says no cache. The system is not to create a cache. It's not to store the contents of the website, and every time someone types in the website name or follows a link to the website, the server must revalidate the information, and that is so that the website is always up to date and people are not looking at out-of-date information. And that's what that means. We then have the viewport instruction, and this relates to the problem we have these days, that there are many different sizes of screens, in other words viewports, and this instruction is simply telling the browser to render the website at full normal scale. And we've already said what full normal scale is. It's 1920. We said that in the previous video. 1920 pixels. This is the link to the CSS datasheet. And the CSS, I better get the CSS file. As you can see, I've done different versions of it as I've built the website. We're now on this version here. I'll open that and I'll make it a little bit bigger. There we go. So this is comp, which is just short for computer, comp-2 CSS, and the link is it's in the CSS folder, and it's the comp file in the CSS folder. That's what that means. This is a link. I wish it wouldn't do that. This is a link to the, if I can get it without it doing that, the menu, which we're going to discuss in a later video. This is a link to a thing called jQuery, which is a form of JavaScript, and that is something also we'll discuss in later videos. JavaScript is used to create, shall we say, movement and various visual effects on the screen. So we'll discuss jQuery later on so we don't get confused with all the information. This is a link I mentioned in the first video. This links to the Google Fonts site, Google APIS. In this case, in the last video I chose the Play style font, and I'll show you how to work that portal in another video. In this instance, I've chosen a couple of font families: Prosto 1, Marco 1, and Roboto. So all of that information has come from Google. This is some more jQuery that relates to pop-up pictures, and we're going to talk about that much later. This thing here is the favicons. Favicons are the little symbols that appear when your website is either being stored or being displayed on the internet. I will show you if I can. So this little yellow square, little amber square, is the favicon that I'm choosing to use. Every company these days will have its own favicon, and that will appear when you save the website, and if you have a mobile phone it will appear in your mobile phone bookmarks. So because there are so many screens, we have to have all these different size favicons, and I'll explain much later how to build a favicon library. Finally we come out of the head and we're now in the body. The wrapper is as discussed in video 1, and within the wrapper there's a header and a title and the menu, and then the header closes down here. So let's look at those components. The header, first of all. Let's go into the CSS. There is the header. There are two headers because I have different headers on different pages. The width of the header is 100%, and that's the same as the header in the previous video. It floats left. The background is not a single color. The background is an image, and just to remind you, the image is in the CSS file. That's the background image. And to locate the background image for the browser, you use this piece of code, background:URL, brackets, single inverted commas, and then you have the name of the image. Most images will go in the image file or in the image folder. It's easier for all concerned if you put the background images directly into the CSS file. You can put them elsewhere. You simply need to change the entry that comes before that. You would have to say images/blue JPG. In practice, it's easier just to stick with that simple bit of coding and put the background image in the CSS, and it reminds you that it's a special image because it does different things. As I keep saying, we're going to talk about background images in a later video because they become complicated and they become a bit of a nuisance, and there are things that you need to do to make them work. As it happens, this background image was a nice simple image to use. So that background image is what has given us the blue sea. So everything else is forward of the background image. So whenever I specify, how can I phrase it? Let's put it this way. Whenever I specify header, we automatically get header with image. We don't have to specify the image in the header on this occasion. So that gives us the blue sea and nothing else. I then have a division which I've called MAD, and that is simply short for Made in Cheshire. The MAD image, which contains an image alt, which we discussed in the last video, Made in Cheshire, src, images, made in. This is a PNG image. In the last video we talked about JPG images. If you want an image that is see-through, you have to use the .png. I will talk about images separately so we don't get too confused. As before, this image has a class. In the previous video it had a class image-L. In this case it has a class image-100. What that means is, when we find the image instructions, way down here, right, every image that contains a class of image-100 must be 100% of the size of the div. In other words, the image could be very big or very small. If it's very small, it will be enlarged. If it's very big, it will be shrunken, and it will always be the size of the div. That's what that means. And we're talking about here the made in PNG, which, as I just mentioned, is this here. And when I said it's transparent, that's because you can see the image itself is all of that, but it has no background. That's why you can see the sea behind the writing. I'm going to do images in a separate series of videos. Alright, that's that. And then I've closed that div. Let's just see what the MAD div is comprised of. There we go. It's a 10% div, so it's quite small. It's floated to the right, and I mentioned in the last episode that generally we float everything left, but occasionally you might want to float it right. So we have margin top is 1%, the margin on the right hand side is 2%, and I haven't put any other margins on because I don't need them. Right, next. Div class title. Div class title. The width is 70%. Margin 2% at the top. Nothing on the right. 6% at the bottom. And 6% on the right hand side, and it floats left. I've given it these 6% for a reason, which I will explain. So the 6% on the left hand side is obviously that space there. If you remember in the last video I said that the div will automatically adjust its height to match the content in the div. Now in this case I wanted a certain amount of C. In the last video I achieved more yellow by putting a height on the div, a height of 100 pixels. In this case I've made the div stretch to the height that I want by putting margin of 6% at the bottom of this div. Just to show you that, I'm going to put background. Red. And that shows you how the title div looks. This space here is the 6% created by the margin on the red div. It's that big, 70%, because when the screens get smaller, such as on laptops or tablets or phones, as the screen size shrinks, I don't want that text there to disappear. That also will become obvious in later videos. For now we're only designing for one size screen, and that is the most common size desktop monitor, which is 1920. Let's take that off. What's next? Within the title there is text. It's an H1 title, which we discussed last time, and it says computer build. In between those two words there's a certain amount of code. This code is a span style. Triangular brackets, close the span. So I've opened a span style and I've closed a span style, and by doing that I've wrapped this word build in a span style. I've done that because the word computer is white, and the second part of the word, because I've joined it all together, is a bluey grey. The only way of changing how a font appears within the tagline is to use a span style, and I've used the span to change the colour. So the span style instruction is span style, two words, equals, inverted commas, colour, and the colour has to be spelt the American way, I'm afraid. And the colour is a hex colour, which we haven't yet talked about much, but the hex colour for that bluey grey is that C3CBDE. Then I've closed the inverted commas and closed the bracket. That changes the colour. Whatever that H1 colour was is now overridden and becomes the new blue-grey colour. Close the span, close the H1. Now if this part is a standard H1 tag. By that I mean it's standard for the website. If we go right down through all of this to the H1 tag, there are two H1 tags. That one, I don't know whether you remember in the last video I said theoretically there are 6 H tags, H1, H2, H3, H4, H6, but in reality you can give them different names and you can have an unlimited amount. That was what I was referring to. We'll come back to that. For the time being we're talking about the standard H1, and the standard H1 is colour FFF, which is the colour for white. As I mentioned before, you could write all 6 digits FFF, but you don't need to for black and white. And it's the font weight is 400. I'll talk about font weights in another video. And the font size is 400% because I wanted it big. And the font family is the Prosto one, sans serif again, and that is linked to Google. So that's that line. The tag below it, which I've chosen H4 rather than H2 because it's a subheading and I've used H2 down here somewhere. The H4 is a standard H4 which is colour white, so that's that, and those are both in the div that was coloured red. This is a menu div, and that's the subject of a later video because it gets a bit complicated. And then I've closed the header. Beneath the header I've got this little thing here, div class shad. You'll need a magnifying glass to see this. Hold on a moment. There's this little line, this little grey line underneath. I wanted to create an impression of a little bit of shadow because I wanted to break up these two divs later on. And I didn't want that shadow line to stand out. I wanted it very, very faint and vague. So I've made it small. And this is the CSS for the shadow, because this introduces another thing. Here we are, div, where have I put it? There. Div class shadow. With 100% float left, it has a height of 2 pixels. The reason I've given it a height is because it has no content. Therefore, in order for it to show on the screen, I had to give it a height. It has a background. Now here's the thing. We've talked about hex colors, which are these things. There's a hex color. That's a hex. Hash. Hex. This is a color code, but it's not a hex color code. That stands for red, green, blue, A. That is an RGBA color. In different technologies, colors are defined in different ways. There's the subtractive process and the additive process. This, I think, is this is the additive process. And there are a set of figures to achieve, whereas before we just had one code figure. Here we have 3 figures separated by a comma. I will come to colors later on. I'm just mentioning it because it's here. I will explain all this. But the reason I've chosen the RGBA is because it allows me transparency. And this little bit of shadow only has a transparency of 0.3. If it was 1, it'd be fully solid. If it was 0, it'd be invisible. So it barely shows. Don't worry too much about that, but just be advised that that kind of tag exists, and we will talk about it ad nauseum in a later video. That's the shadow div. What have we got next? Okay, these references, this thing here where it says AC, many years ago, and I've been doing this now for over 14 years, that letter combination meant something, and in the midst of time I've forgotten. Nearly all my divs begin with the letters AC, and that's simply to remind me that I can't begin a div with a number. So if we look at the CSS, you'll see here I've got various things. I've got an AC70 and an AC96. I've got an AC50. You can choose your own description as long as it begins with a letter and not a number. So all that means is, when I find it, I have an AC60 div. Now I know without looking at it, that's going to be a 60% div, because that's what it means. Right, so it's 52% visible. It floats left. Margin top 3%, margin right 6%. Align left. So although I've called it AC60 because it started life as a 60% div, as I was designing the site, I found that I had to change the shape of it slightly. So strictly speaking, if I'm following my own convention, that should be an AC52 div. But I'd already numbered it. So in this case, the AC60 is only 52%. However, it does have that 6% there. So 6 and 2 is 8. It's actually a 58% div, truth be told. It has a text align left. I mentioned last time that you don't have to say text align left. I did it in this case because there's a lot of coding in this part of the website, and I didn't want the browser to get confused. So let me put a color on that again. Background. I do this all the time when I'm trying to figure out the actual size of the div I've created. I will call it background red again, and this will tell us immediately. You see, if you just look at that now, it looks a little bit confusing because you're not sure what's what and what's where. Put a color on the background temporarily, and straight away you know what you've got. So we've got that. Go back to it. 6%. We have 6% on the left. I didn't put a margin on the right, but I just kept it short. So because I've called it a 60% div, it's 52% with a 6% margin. So it's only 58% wide, and because it's only 58% wide, I have that bit of white space there, which is what I wanted. Take that red off. So this is the area we're now talking about. Take that off. And so what have we got in the AC60 div? Right. Okay, we have an H2. And then I've altered it with a span style. So we have a standard H2 color, but I've overridden the color and I've made it red with a span style color red, but only for the first letter. So the real color of the H2, the real color is that dark bluey grey, which is the same as this color down here. That's what it should look like. But because I wanted to be cleverer than I should be, I wanted this slogan, built better in Britain, computers created in Cheshire. So I've highlighted the first letters and I've used a span style to change the color. You can see I'm running Audacity in the background. Talk about Audacity in a later video. I'm using that to record the sound. Let's go back to the subject that we've got here. So H2 has got span styles to highlight the leading letters. I've opened a span style, closed a span style, opened a span style, closed a span style, opened a span style, closed a span style, closed the H2. Done the same with the H3. This time I've created the color blue for the letter C. Open span style. I've also changed the weight. The normal weight of the H3, let's have a look. The weight of the H3 is 400. So I've decided to make the first letter bolder as well as a different color. I'm going to talk about font weights in the next video or the one after. Not for now. So In this span style, I've not only changed the colour, like I did here, I've changed the boldness of the letter C, and I've changed the colour. And I've done it 3 times for each of the C's created, computers created in Cheshire. We're still in the 60 div because it doesn't close until there. And if you remember in the previous video, I said you have these little aide-memoirs that you can put in. And that's because you've got so many divs now, divs in divs in divs, and you can get lost as to where you are. So that tells me that I've closed the 60 div there, and it also tells me that all of this is in the 60 div. Under those 2 headings, 2 text headings, I have a div class here that's a spacer. This will offend the purists, and I don't care, because it's my website. Let's have a look at spacers. There we go. This spacer is 100% wide. It has a depth of 5 pixels because it's got no content, and it has a margin above and below. So this is, as the word says, this is creating space and doing nothing else. I use it a lot. As far as I know, I'm the only person that does this kind of thing, which is probably very illegal in the HTML world. And I've got different kind of spacers. This one here has got a 4% top and bottom margin, so that's a bigger spacer. This is a smaller spacer. And I've even got a spacer adjust, which I'm not going to talk about just now. Right, so that div does nothing except create space between this bunch of text and this bunch of text. We now have the H1 class Marco, which I referenced a minute ago. So we have 2 H1s on this website. That is the standard one and the special one. And we've made it special by writing H1 dot Marco. And the dot, as you may recall, means class. This is an H1 of the special class Marco. And instead of it having a font family Prosto 1, it has a font family Marco 1. And something else changes. It also has a font style italic. The colour is different and the size is different. So it's got, and there's padding at the bottom. There are a number of different ways you can extend the official range of the H1, H2 numbers. Here's another one. I've got an H2M. There's an H2. Both of those H2s are the Roboto family, but the H2M I've made italic, and it's a different size, and it's a different colour, and it's got a different padding at the bottom. So that's how you can create different H2s, and you can also create different P's, which I haven't done on this site yet. Still a work in progress. Alright, so H1 class Marco, designed to inspire, H2 class M, whatever you want to do, and that produces this heading here. That's the H1 Marco, and that's the H2 M. That's how we got that shape. Then we have these little steps inward, indents. And that's another little trick of the trade. Below, so I'm in the 60% div. I've got a bunch of text there. Then I've put a spacer in. I've got another bunch of text there. And then I've switched to a div a div in a div, just like the heading. This inset div is inside the AC60 div. Let's have a look at the inset div. Width 92%, floats left, margin to the left is 8%. Let's put some colour on it. Background. Let's do green this time. There it is. So let's analyse what we just said. Width 92%. Now that 92% is 92% of the 60% div. So in terms of page size, which is 100%, you have 60%, and then you have a div inside the 60%, which is 92%, but it's 92% of the 60%. And by making it 92%, that means I've got space on either side. And I've said here we are. I wanted 8% space on the left. So the width is 92%, float left, margin left is 8%, 8% and 92% is 100%. And that goes there to the edge of the 60% div. I'm going to take the green off now. So how did I get this stepped effect? The reason I've put this section of text in a div is because I wanted to mess around with it, and I didn't want it kind of floating around the page, out of control. So this is an H2 class M, which is the same as that, and it just simply sits inside the inset div, so it's got an 8% indent because of that div. So do it better is indented as so. So now we've got these other extra indents, and the extra indents have been caused by this little devil here. This is the code for a non-breaking space point. Every non-breaking space point is the size of a letter. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 6 letters indented, and then the words do it better. And then this one has got more letters indented, and that comes out as do it more securely. And it's got an M dash. An M dash gives you a nice long dash. Let me look at that. There we go, that's the M dash. If you just use an ordinary keyboard dash, it's shorter. I use the M dash to make it look longer. In the print world it's got a special name, I think. So the AND at the beginning of the instruction and the semicolon at the end makes it a special feature. And this is the same, an AND at the beginning of the instruction and a semicolon at the end. Just while I'm mentioning it, because these non-breaking space points are in a row, they create space horizontally. If you put a non-breaking space point in a div, and you keep doing that, div and NBSP, div NBSP, you can create space vertically. I use a spacer, but you can create that to create a vertical or a horizontal spacer. So that's the inset finished. We've now got a class, div class VL. Again, the coding gives me a clue. V in my language means there's a video involved, and L means it's to the left of some other text. So we'll look at VL. There it is. Okay, VL is 100%, floats left, 1% margin at the top, and that is all. Let's put a colour on that. Background. Let's do aqua. So there you are, that's the VL div. Still within the 60 div, but it's got two types of content in it. And if you remember in the first video, we split a div up by putting a picture, an image on the left hand side. In this case, I split the div by putting a video, an embedded video, which, like so many other things, we'll talk about in a later video of our own. So let's look at the code for the VL. Within the VL there is a V40PL. So that tells me that's going to be a 40% div. The P1 actually wasn't PL, it was P1. That just tells me it's page 1. So if I look at it's a video is involved and it's a 40%. We'll look at that. There it is, 40%. I knew that without looking at it. Floats left. Margin at the top 1%, margin on the right hand side 2%, and then that is because I don't want it to bang up against the text that I'm going to put in. So I created that bit of space there. I need to take that off, don't I? There we go. So I've embedded the video in it there, more about that later, and then I've just used an ordinary paragraph command to write text in the 60% of the div that's left over. And that, I think, is enough for this video. We've covered a lot of ground, introduced some new ideas. We've talked about RGBA and span styles and changing the appearance of a standard H1 tag. So I think that's enough for this video. Thank you for watching. Tune in for video 3. Bye bye.